So a lot of people keep saying the MCU is dead, and a lot of that discourse started with Thor Love and Thunder. These types of discussions I find to be infuriating. I've been hearing Star Wars is dead for the past 6 years, and all those videos piss me off. But is there any merit to it with the MCU? When I talk to normal people who aren't like us, who rant about movies on the internet, they often say they don't care about the MCU anymore. I've heard countless times that the MCU was over once Endgame happened. This is fair. Endgame felt like a pretty good endgame for the MCU. I'd understand why people don't want it to continue, but is the sheer existence of Marvel stories after Endgame the reason why so many people seem disgruntled with it? At the time of writing this introduction to the video, I haven't seen Thor Love and Thunder since its release a year ago. I made a video about it and explained why I didn't like it, but that was a year ago. Things and people change. The MCU is in a different place now than it was a year ago. So how will I feel about rewatching this movie for the first time in 1 year? How has the MCU changed in that year? And after watching all these rage bait the MCU is dead videos, is there some merit to it that is clearly evident in Thor Love and Thunder? Hello everybody and welcome to another video. My name is The Goldman and today let's rewatch and reanalyze Thor Love and Thunder 1 year later. So upon my 1 year later rewatch, what I found to be the most frustrating was that this movie has the foundation to be not only a good Marvel movie, but a great one. The best Marvel movies I feel are the ones that, while having a lighter tone, do take themselves relatively seriously and try to convey an interesting or powerful message. The story of Thor Love and Thunder is built upon two ideas, one being the role gods play in the universe, and the other being the importance of love and not being scared of getting hurt. This second idea of love I find to be uninteresting. Sure, I agree with the message, but it's been overdone throughout the years, and I don't think Marvel could add anything meaningful to that conversation, especially since the heart of this love subplot is based on a relationship that audiences were never invested in the first place. The other idea of exploring the roles of gods is a far more interesting concept. From a narrative perspective, this theme is rather similar to that of Captain America Civil Wars. That movie was mostly about the accountability of superheroes and how they should be managed, so Thor introduces the concept of accountability in regards to gods. Given their track record of the MCU up until this point, there are so many instances where gods or god-esque characters wreaked havoc across the galaxy. Thanos, while technically being a titan, obliterated half the universe. Many people probably see him as a god, and he used his power to commit genocide. What about Escharum in Eternals? Yes, technically he's a celestial instead of a god, but again, it's all just semantics. He had the power to destroy Earth, and people are just supposed to accept that. Ego is also a god-esque figure who could have destroyed Earth, and then of course we have the opening of this movie. People were suffering, and a god just sat by and could have done something but chose not to. Another reason this concept is so brilliant is because it easily has real-world applications. Sure, we don't literally have gods walking around making decisions, but the influence of many gods is felt across our planet, for both good and bad. How are these gods or their religions held accountable? All the pieces were there for Thor Love and Thunder to be a story that explored some really interesting concepts, but Taika Waititi and others involved just don't seem interested in these ideas. They basically only use this as a character motivation for the villain, and then use the rest of the movie to explore the importance of love. Of all the Phase 4 movies and shows, it appears to me at least that Thor Love and Thunder is the one that is criticized the most, behind She-Hulk. The reason why is because audiences recognize the inherent laziness behind this movie. Audiences aren't dumb. Even when they walk into a theater just for some mindless action, they recognize when a story can do something more clever and choose not to. And it's not simply because the movie chose to explore something that I wasn't interested in. It's more so because it chose to explore something that again has been repeated over and over. This movie introduces so many many plot contrivances. People love to blame the excessive humor for this movie's major downfalls, and while that's certainly part of it, good or bad humor does not change the lazy decisions Waititi made with this film. Audiences can tell when a movie introduces some bullshit just to move the story from A to B. So here's a small list. 1. Jane could hear a broken Mjolnir call out to her while she was sick. How Mjolnir could do that, I have no clue. I get this could be part of the comics, but I don't care. 2. There happens to be a sword that can kill gods right next to a guy who wants to kill all the gods. It would have been a far more interesting story if Gorr actually had to find the sword. This would have made for an interesting opening act. 3. Apparently there's something in the center of the universe that can grant anyone a wish. This is the laziest contrivance in the movie. Instead of thinking of a clever way to have Gorr pose a threat to all the gods, he just needs to go somewhere and make a wish. Uninventive and lazy, and I don't care if this eternity thing is in the comics. 4. This thunderbolt weapon is powerful enough to stop Gorr, but for whatever reason, Stormbreaker and Mjolnir are not. 5. Thor can just choose to give a bunch of people the power of Thor. I've heard some others say that the lightning bolt is what could give people the power of Thor. If so, this is just another contrivance anyway, because the idea of this being a weapon that could grant others immense power is not even remotely hinted at until the final battle. It would have been far more interesting if the reason Thor wanted this weapon in the first place was because he could grant others the power of Thor. There are a bunch of other small contrivances, like how the only way to get to eternity is with Thor's weapon, or how Jane somehow knows how to navigate across the galaxy after being Thor for like 2 days. So for a good portion of the rest of this video, I want to dive deep into each of the characters. A lot of these videos I've watched on this movie just say this sucks, blah blah blah. Since we are intellectually superior here on The Goldman, we're gonna try to improve aspects of this story as we go through each of the characters. So with each character, we're going to look at the current story arc they go on, how it pretty much doesn't work at all, and how its potential could have been easily tied into the story. So let's begin. First, let's discuss the titular character, Thor. There's been a lot that's already been said about Thor in the past year. How, again, Thor goes on a journey of needing to discover himself, or how this movie made Thor an idiot. Yeah, sure, those are true, but I want to try and add something new to the conversation. I'll get to his arc in a second, but my largest issue with Thor isn't that he's an idiot, it's that he appears to be completely unaware of his surroundings. There are numerous examples of Thor making decisions in this movie without any regards to those around him, like when he destroys the castle in the beginning of the movie, or when he uses the Bifrost right in the middle of a building, or when he's making jokes around parents who had just lost their kids. The first movie had a similar portrayal of Thor. Thor is often clueless as to what's going on, and it's played for comedic effect, but as you'll see in a second, there's a big difference in the way these two clueless Thors are portrayed. In the first Thor movie, his cluelessness is because he's a fish out of water. It makes sense why he is so naive to the behavioral norms of Earth. In Thor: Love and Thunder, the only reason it is present is because Taika wants to make the audience laugh. In his 8th MCU appearance, Thor should not be acting like this anymore. Thor Ragnarok had a great balance of making Thor a bit goofy while maintaining his reputation. Thor was not a drunk uncle, he was a competent warrior who happened to be a bit goofy. What's Thor's excuse here? He's a hippie now since he has no responsibilities? Of course, Taika's insistence on injecting humor is the largest reason for this, but unfortunately, Thor faces the brunt of Taika's misplaced humor. This ties into a larger issue I have with this movie that I'm gonna dive far deeper into later, and that's the blatant ignorance to Thor's 7-movie journey up to this point. Audiences don't mind seeing a goofy character, but what we do mind is seeing a clear regression of said character without a sensible reason. Therefore, all the moments this movie tries to take itself seriously are either a result of an unforced joke or Thor's degraded reputation. So Thor's simple portrayal in this movie is bothersome, but in typical Goldman fashion, let's take a look at his arc. Thor's arc is all about learning to embrace love again after heartbreak. As I've stated numerous times, it's not an interesting theme, but it's not the worst in the world. What I find to be the most frustrating is that the source of Thor's pain seems to stem from Jane rather than the death of his parents, his brother, his best friend, or half his people. Yeah, it's briefly mentioned in this prologue, but it's never mentioned again. If you want the audience to empathize with Thor's pain, why don't you have the root of all that pain maybe the countless deaths we have seen on screen instead of a breakup we saw in a flashback that chronologically happened over 3 movies ago. Literally all the most traumatic moments of Thor's life we saw on screen, but the root of his trauma is the breakup of a relationship we never were invested in the first place. Missed potential. But even if Taika wanted to tell this story with this arc and this motivation, it still lacks the qualities of a compelling arc. Yes, Thor does change. He goes from rejecting love to embracing it again. And sure, Thor's arc does cause the villain to change. It was Thor's plea at the end that convinced Gorr not to kill all the gods but to revive his daughter. The larger issue is that Thor's flaw about rejecting love isn't something that hinders him. Sure, it makes him less happy, but with a proper character arc, the character should suffer the consequences of their flaw. Could you argue that the reason Thor is a bumbling idiot for the rest of the movie is because he is so unhappy? I guess. I didn't really get that vibe from the movie, but you wouldn't be wrong. So as it currently stands, Thor goes from rejecting love the whole movie to seeing Jane want to be proud of her last moments, telling Gorr that he is only seeking love and to revive his daughter instead. That's not an arc to me. That's a character who changed. Now I do have a significantly larger issue, but I'll get to that when I talk about Gorr later on. So now that I have discussed my issues with Thor's arc, let's try and rework it slightly to make the movie significantly more interesting. As I teased before, I'm not interested in a learning to love story. I want to heavily lean on the accountability of God's part of this movie. So in my rewrite of Thor's arc, I want him to have a more personal connection to Gorr. As it currently stands, Gorr doesn't have an issue per se with Thor himself. He just doesn't like that Thor's a god and that the only reason he attacked Thor was because he needed the access to the Bifrost. I find stories to be far more interesting when there is a direct relationship between the hero and villain. So the first thing I need to change is Gorr's motivation. I already do love the intro scene with Gorr in the beginning, but I'm gonna make a change that I feel will still keep that same emotional impact. So Gorr will be with his daughter, struggling in the desert. And then, like Yelena in the Hawkeye series, we will see Gorr disappear and return because of the blip. When he comes back, he goes to those gods and asks about his daughter. And he learns that his daughter died during the 5 years that he was dead. But she didn't die because of Thanos, she survived the blip but then actually died. The god basically says the same thing, like how he could have helped but didn't, and this enrages Gorr and he kills the god. Instead of him using the Necro Sword, however, he's just a strong dude who can kill a god. Maybe lazy, but I prefer it over the sword being there in the beginning. So going back to Thor's story, he can begin the movie still a bit of a fool, but not a complete idiot. He causes some destruction but doesn't seem to care all that much. Then he starts hearing about Gorr the God Butcher, and Gorr steals all the kids from Asgard. Instead of trying to find eternity to make some dumbass wish, he's actively looking for the Necro Sword so he can kill more gods, especially Thor. Thor needs to assemble a team, and Jane shows up with a similar backstory that we got in the movie, but more on her later. Valkyrie is there too, and so is Korg. For most of the movie, Thor is simply under the assumption that Gorr wants to kill all the gods. He goes to Omnipotent City to warn the other gods, but none of them seem to care. You don't need to make Zeus some bumbling idiot, but you can tell he has no interest in helping other gods or ordinary people. Now, in the current movie, the gods being useless idiots here and proving Gorr correct is completely glossed over. So in my version, Thor is aware that the gods are failing people. So Thor tracks Gorr down to the Shadow Realm or whatever where they fight, but our main heroes lose and Gorr manages to get the Necro Sword. During this fight, Gorr reveals to Thor that he's not only mad at the gods for failing his daughter, he's not only mad at Thanos, who used the Infinity Stones to separate him from his daughter, but he's mad at the man who could have stopped it all but let his ego get in the way. That was Thor. So the personal relationship I wanted between Gorr and Thor is that Gorr partially blames Thor for what happened, because he didn't go for the head. How Gorr would learn about this could be for a number of different reasons. He could have simply heard a story about what happened when half the galaxy died and how a man named Thor could have stopped it but didn't. Now that Gorr has the Necro Sword, he goes to Omnipotent City and starts killing all the gods. Thor starts to realize how gods are never held accountable for their actions. So he goes to Omnipotent City as well and tries to convince Gorr to stop. Gorr says what kind of father would he be if he didn't avenge his daughter? Now instead of a pseudo-redemption arc, he doesn't change and Thor has to kill him. The epilogue, however, will show Thor vowing to take his role as a god more seriously and make sure the innocents are helped when their gods refuse to help. So the ending of my version of this movie has very little to do with love, but I think my resolution would be a bit more interesting. The movie also isn't about Thor finding himself again, it's about learning to take on his new role with his life a bit more seriously, instead of sitting on the sidelines not doing anything anymore. Also, I'm a big fan of this type of character arc where the hero learns a valuable lesson from the villain and vows to change things so people don't end up like the villain anymore. Now, how do other characters tie into this news story? Well, let's start by looking at Jane. Before I continue on with the rest of this video, only 7.2% of my viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Now, this may or may not be a hot take, but I found Jane to be easily the best part of the movie. She's one of the few people that feels like a real human being, one that's not an idiot at least. Her motivations make sense, and her part of the story is the only thing that Taika doesn't try to make a joke out of. Jane's story is heavily tied into this theme of love. Now, unlike Thor, who's about learning to embrace love again, Jane's story is more about embracing the time you have with those you love. We learn in the beginning of the movie that she has stage 4 cancer, which pretty much means certain death. One day, however, she happens to hear a voice call to her, and that voice was Mjolnir. Mjolnir decides to reform because Thor casted a spell to always protect Jane. So now that she's dying, Mjolnir must keep Jane alive. This is more so about the use of Mjolnir rather than Jane's story, but I also found this to be another plot contrivance. Mjolnir was destroyed in the previous movie, but now we learn that it's still sentient, I guess, and can reform for Jane. I have no clue how the comics handled this mighty Thor story, but if it does follow the same approach as the movie, I still don't like it. So while I think how she became the mighty Thor is kinda dumb, I do like the concept of her being able to wield the power of Thor. There's moments throughout the movie where Jane acts like a superhero rookie, wanting her own catchphrase and talking about fighting her first bad guy. This is the shit that makes a person feel human. Also, for the first time, it gives Jane a bit of a personality, something she was completely lacking in her first 2 movies. For most of the movie, she's just along for the ride, but the decision she decides to make at the end of the movie was one that, while not entirely original, I do like. One of my favorite aspects of Breaking Bad was how Walter White didn't want to just sit on chemo until the cancer killed him. He wanted to live his life, even if it meant that he would die sooner. Jane pretty much has this same approach. She tells Thor that she will stay on chemo, but she can't ignore the chance to be a superhero one last time. So even though she does end up dying shortly thereafter, she gets to be the hero for once, and she helped save those kids. Now, this movie still didn't do anything for the Thor/Jane relationship. I still don't think they have much chemistry, but this movie did the best at attempting to give them chemistry. But given that I don't like the thematic decisions this movie decided to explore, I don't have any issues with how it chose to explore those themes through Jane. Now, just like what I did with the Thor section, let's discuss how I feel Jane's story could have been improved. My new version of the story is going to focus on the accountability of gods rather than embracing love. Considering Jane's story is literally all about the love part of the movie, how can her story be tied into the themes of gods? Well, actually, relatively easily. Jane is in the unique position that she is just an ordinary person who can now wield the power of a god. She isn't one, but she knows what it's like to be a god. So her story will pretty much be the same structurally. She'll have stage 4 cancer, she'll become the mighty Thor, and she'll help the real Thor to try and stop Gorr. Now, like Gorr, she has seen the destructions that gods or godlike figures can cause. She knows that Loki, who is a god, launched an attack on New York, and she's most likely aware of what Thanos did with the Infinity Stones. It's never specifically stated in the movie whether or not she got erased from Thanos' snap, but based on this one line, I'm inclined to believe she was.
What's it been, like 3, 4 years?
8 years, 7 months and 6 days. I haven't forgotten.
She hadn't seen Thor in 3 years, Thor hadn't seen her in 8 years, aka a 5-year time difference. So let's live under the assumption that she was blipped. In my story, we can learn that she was diagnosed with cancer before the Thanos event happened, so she disappears and comes back, only to learn that because of all the people who have been gone for 5 years, she's unable to get the proper treatment she needs for her cancer. This causes her to get sick far quicker, so by the beginning of this movie, she is really sick. I can't think of a more clever way for her to become the mighty Thor, so we can just keep the current version even though I don't really like it. My goal here with this new backstory for Jane is that it's going to mirror Gorr's story. Both characters were struggling before Thanos, but after they came back, they both suffered devastating consequences. Gorr decided to take his anger and go after all the gods, believing all gods must die. What Jane is going to do is the opposite. Since she has the power to become a god, she's going to use her position to try and be there for those who need it. So when these kids get stolen by Gorr, she wants to be there to save them because that's what someone with her kind of power should do. When I spoke about Thor, I mentioned how his arc will be about learning to take his role as a god a bit more seriously and use his power to actively help people. While he comes to this realization because he doesn't want people to end up like Gorr, he also changes because of Jane's actions and feels inspired to honor her as well. This way, Jane plays an active part in helping our main character go on a compelling character arc. Towards the end of the second act, there's going to be the same beat of Jane laying in the hospital and Thor telling her to stay because he doesn't want to lose her. And she will still make the same decision to pretty much sacrifice her life to save the kids. Only this time it's about saving the kids and helping other gods. When she tells Thor why she came back, it's because gods should always put their lives at risk to save their people and not stand idly by. This will be the moment that Thor changes. Jane will end up dying and the people of Asgard will always be grateful for her for saving their children. And other gods will feel inspired to change their actions because she helped save them. And just like that, the narrative beats of what happened to Jane are exactly the same, but the motivations and thematic significance behind why she is in the movie is greatly improved. Jane's current story arc in this movie is one I do enjoy. When she was first announced to come back, I was certainly skeptical, but even though the movie was a major letdown, almost none of it had to do with Jane, and I think they made the right decision to bring her back. I still feel they could have done even more with her story, and let me know if you think my version of Jane in this movie accomplishes that. Let's take a look at Gorr. Gorr is a bit of a mixed bag for me. The overall presentation of the character I found to be fantastic. The aesthetic of Gorr after he receives the Necro Sword was intriguing. In a movie filled with jokes, it's nice that at least this part of it was taken seriously, and they definitely did that with Gorr. Christian Bale is also one of the best actors working in Hollywood today, and he kills it in this role. Frankly, I wonder what made Christian Bale want to take this role in this movie. The movie blows, but he surely was interested, I suppose. Maybe this is less so about Gorr, but rather the cinematography. But when they're fighting on that moon or whatever in the Shadow Realm, the black and white that is around Gorr and the other characters is one of the most visually interesting fights in all of the MCU. And when it comes to the character development of Gorr, I would say it was serviceable. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the movie was off to a strong start with Gorr's backstory. A man loves his daughter dies, and he blames the gods. Boom, motivation. I will say this though, I'm kind of tired of villains' motivations stemming from a singular event. I'm not saying it's unrealistic that the villain's entire motivation can stem from a single tragic event, I just find it to be a little lazy. Instead of taking the time to develop a complex backstory for the villain that has led to the person we see today, just thinking of the death of a loved one to motivate the character has been done so many times. Again, I don't hate it, I just find it to be rather unoriginal. Gorr doesn't have much of a personality. He has the motivation, but besides that, he acts like a typical Marvel villain. This movie employs another trope that I don't like, and that's having the main villain be possessed. It's revealed in the movie that it's not so much Gorr that wants to kill all the gods, it's the Necro Sword. There is almost nothing worse you can do to a character than remove any agency from them. When characters have agency, they make decisions, and said decisions allow us to learn more about the character. When Jane chooses to sacrifice her life to save the kids, that was an active decision Jane made that revealed to us her priorities in life. Why Gorr couldn't just want to kill all the gods completely by his own will and possess a sword that could do that leaves my head spinning. Now, earlier in the video, I teased an aspect of Gorr's story that I took major issue with. Well, that issue I have with Gorr is that he's a moron. His daughter is dead, and his goal throughout the movie is to find eternity so he can wish for anything in the universe. Instead of wishing for his daughter back, he wishes for all the gods to die? What idiot father would do this? If you were to ask any parent who lost a child due to murder if they would magically wish for the murderer to be dead or for their child to come back, I guarantee you over 99% of parents would choose to bring their daughter back. The thematic climax is Gorr realizing that he shouldn't use his wish out of hate, he should use it out of love. I just can't get behind it because the second the concept of this eternity was introduced in the movie, I asked myself, why doesn't he just wish for his daughter back? It may seem like a small thing, but when your entire story revolves around your main villain making stupid decisions, it's hard for me to be invested in his or the main character's arc. That's like if in Star Wars A New Hope, the rebels steal the plans to the Death Star so they could sell sell it to some pirates and use the money to build a weapon to destroy the Death Star. Geez, how about you use the plans to the Death Star to destroy the Death Star? Or sticking to Marvel, say Infinity War was all about Thanos wanting to get the Infinity Stones so he can physically go to planets, take them over, and kill half the population with his firing squad like he did to Gamora's homeworld. Geez, how about you just use the Infinity Stones to wipe out half the universe? Eternity in this movie is pretty much a MacGuffin. It's something that everyone is after, and we need to stop the villain from reaching it. But when the MacGuffin is used for idiotic reasons, it can severely drag the movie down. That's my biggest issue with Gorr, and unfortunately, it's a rather big issue. So if we transition back to rewriting this movie, I made some changes to Gorr that would eliminate this. I pretty much summarized my main points with Gorr back in my Thor section, but to go over it again briefly, Gorr isn't going to be after some magical wish he can use. He's still motivated by the death of his daughter, and he is going to use that motivation to find the Necro Sword. This way, Gorr has actual agency and isn't possessed by a magic sword. Also, it removes the possibility of him reviving his daughter, an aspect of the movie I didn't like at all. So Gorr is going to spend most of the movie getting to the sword, and once he does, he's going to go back to Omnipotence City and start killing gods. At the end of the movie, Thor will try to convince him to stop, but Gorr is not going to redeem himself. Thor is going to have to actually stop Gorr with his power, and Gorr will die. I'm not sure if I would classify Gorr's current story as a redemption arc. He kind of just changes his mind at the end of the movie and realizes he's an idiot, but I like it when a villain has a strong desire and they die maintaining that desire. Unless a redemption arc is clearly set up throughout the story, I find this path much more interesting. So Gorr's story had potential, just like Jane's and Thor's. It's really his story that focuses on what I find to be the most interesting part of the movie, and that's holding gods accountable. But of course, like everything in this movie, Gorr wasn't used properly, and thus the most memorable aspect of his character was that he was played by Christian Bale. And that's it. Since I've wrapped up the three main characters of this movie, let's take the time to discuss some of the supporting characters and how they all kinda sucked. None of them really added anything to the story besides more attempts at humor. First, we have Valkyrie. Valkyrie is now king of Asgard, which is kinda weird cause, you know, she's a woman, but I guess being queen isn't good enough these days. So what does Valkyrie add to this movie? She's just there to help fight with Thor. That's it. She doesn't add anything emotionally. She has one conversation with Korg about how she used to have a girlfriend she loved, but that conversation is never held with Thor, and thus it plays no significance to the story. That's kind of it. She gets stabbed at the end of the second act and is not present for the final battle. She's just here because people kinda liked her in the last movie. But of course, like almost everything, there was potential for her. For those of you who may not remember, Valkyrie was once part of a group called the Valkyries, and they all got killed by Hela, the goddess of death. Let me repeat that. Her people all got killed by a goddess. I think Gorr brings this up once briefly, but why they didn't use it as a bigger thread to tie into the story is baffling. Even if they wanted to keep the story more focused on love than gods, you could have used Valkyrie's backstory as a way to maybe have her empathize with Gorr. Or instead of Thor trying to reach out to Gorr, she is the one who does it because she knows what it's like to have your life ruined by gods. But no, Taika didn't want to do that. In my hypothetical rewrite, there are so many unique ways I could tie her into the story, but I'll stick with what I wrote above, that she helps Thor take his role as god seriously. Valkyrie is another wasted character, but what sucks even more than that was that there was no attempt to do anything with her. So that's kind of worse than wasted potential in my book. But next we have Korg, and I probably shouldn't say up next because he serves absolutely no role in the story. Like actually zero. Why he's even brought along makes no sense. At least Valkyrie is the leader of New Asgard. Korg was awesome in Ragnarok. He was goofy, sure, but it wasn't overblown, and he had a valid reason to be in that movie. But here he's not only useless, but so annoying. Almost every time he's on screen, I just want him to shut up. It makes me sad knowing that I hate Korg now. But we all know why he's really in the movie, right? It's because he's played by none other than Taika Waititi himself. Taika just wanted to be in the movie. That's it, no other reason. Useless and wasted. How about Zeus? At least he wasn't useless, but man was he annoying. They could have made the point that the most powerful god is kind of useless and doesn't care about ordinary people, but there is a better way to do that than what they did in the movie. Zeus kind of just seems like an incompetent loser. Oh, haha, he has orgies and he's kinda chubby and wears a little goofy outfit. I'm not asking for him to look like Zeus from the Snyder Cut, but at least take his character a bit more seriously. Zeus was a perfect way for the story to explore the misgivings of gods, but no, it didn't do that. How about the Guardians? I often forget they were in this movie. Now, I don't mind that they were underutilized. There's only so many characters you can fit into this movie, and I don't need the entire Guardians cast to be present here, so I'm not gonna say they were wasted. They were in it just enough. But you know what was kind of a missed opportunity? Peter Quill's relevance to this story. If the story were to have focused on the god part, you know who would have had some interesting insight to share? The guy whose dad was a celestial who willingly killed the woman he loved just because he didn't want to risk love. I'm sure Peter would have had something to say. There's not really anyone else to talk about. I could talk about Axel, who had his name changed as a joke. Speaking of which, his dad was killed by someone who was basically a god. Maybe he could have added something to the story. By the way, I hate these goats. Screw these goddamn goats. They are the worst. No one wants to hear screaming goats for 2 hours. So there's not much else to add. The supporting characters of this movie, like, again, everything else, could have added something, but they didn't. Shocker. We need to talk about Taika Waititi. Since he is the director, he holds a significant portion of the blame. Taika made 2 major mistakes with this movie. The first is an obvious one, and that's the over-reliance of humor, and the second is a rejection of the universe Marvel has established. First, let's discuss the humor. A lot of critics are saying that if you can enjoy the humor, you will like this movie, but if you can't, then you won't. And I'm obviously on the side that didn't enjoy it. The problem I have here is that the humor came at the expense of the story and the immersion of the world. Now, there was a good portion of this movie that I did find to be funny, but oftentimes I would laugh and say to myself, man, that's dumb. Like, there's this one time where Thor is talking to all the kids that just got captured and he's trying to make them feel better, and then as this is happening, Valkyrie is tickling his face with her hair. This is the type of humor that I hate. Thor is trying to save a bunch of children and you're tickling him? You're going to see me reference Thor Ragnarok a lot because that movie blended humor and tone beautifully. Thor Ragnarok is a really funny movie, but I never felt like Taika was injecting humor at the expense of the story. The emotional moments of that movie hit because I'm able to take the plot and the characters seriously. There's something that this movie does that I absolutely hate, and that's adding humor to scenes from previous movies that are rather powerful. Like, Korg has a few monologues in this movie where he's talking about the events from the past. When he's talking about Thor's past, he mentions how Loki died 3 times throughout the MCU, and it's played as a joke when they show Thanos killing him. That scene was great and not supposed to be funny, but here it's played off as a joke. If I look at the previous 3 Thor movies, clearly there's a stark difference between the tone of the first 2 and the tone of the third. But in my mind, I can still imagine them being a part of the same universe, because what's happening in Thor Ragnarok is still serious enough where it matches the first 2 Thor movies. But here, I cannot imagine this is in the same universe as the old Thor movies. Recently, I did watch the first and second Thor movie to remind myself what Thor was like. There's this one conversation in the Dark World where Odin tells Loki that they are not gods and that they are born, they live, and they die. It adds a realism to the MCU that these gods are essentially people too. And then in this movie, we see all these gods in an arena and one of them's a dumpling. Was that really necessary? Was making your audience laugh for 2 seconds really worth making your movie feel like a parody? It was not. But you know what was the dumbest aspect of the humor for me? The damn love triangle between Thor, Mjolnir, and Stormbreaker. Not once in the previous 7 appearances of Thor was Mjolnir or Stormbreaker presented to us as living beings that actually have thoughts and emotions. Sometimes Thor likes to say something to them like they're people, but I always saw it like when someone says something nice about their car. You know it's not real, but you love it so much that you will sometimes talk to it like a person. In this movie, Mjolnir and Stormbreaker are actual characters. Thor straight up has conversations with the both of them multiple times in this movie. I think the first time it happened in the movie, it was really funny, but then after the 10th time when Thor was tickling Stormbreaker and pouring beer on it, I almost lost it. And not in a good way. Stormbreaker actually has the ability to get jealous and be mad at Thor at the same time. The humanization of these 2 weapons was idiotic. This ties into the second issue I had with Taika, and that's his rejection of what came before in the MCU. This movie strangely ignores a lot of what came before. Sure, we get a brief summary of the previous 3 Thor movies, and Thor's development in Endgame is also addressed, but I feel Taika only acknowledges a few previous events while not considering how they would realistically affect our characters. In this video, I spoke about Thor, Jane, Gorr, Valkyrie, Korg, Peter, and Axel. For each one, I was able to reference something that either happened in a previous movie or was established in a previous movie and use that to help build the characters. Taika only does that with Thor, and that's the bare minimum. But outside of simple character development, there's so many other things that this movie does that seem foreign to what came before. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, making Mjolnir and Stormbreaker sentient beings completely ignores what was previously established, and Taika only did this because he wanted to tell some jokes. Or better yet, Thor giving all the kids the power of Thor. Why was this never done before? Especially during an Avengers film? It makes no sense. There's this one ice cream shop on New Asgard called Infinity Scones. Sure, it's clever wordplay, but remember, Thanos is the guy who murdered half of Asgard before the snap, so the events of Endgame didn't bring these people back. This is like opening a store named after a certain German dude with a mustache in a Jewish community. It would be realistically completely insensitive. Another example would be Mjolnir coming back. If it can magically rebuild itself for Jane, why couldn't it do it for Thor right after Hela destroyed it? I don't need to list every example. I think you guys get my point. How was Taika able to get away with this? Well, because in Ragnarok, it kinda worked in its favor to ignore the past. Thor Ragnarok was Thor's 5th movie, and his first 4 appearances are all kinda forgettable. That movie desperately needed to reinvent the Thor character, and it did so wonderfully. Thor Love and Thunder tried to do something similar, I guess, but it didn't work. You could also argue that once Taika proved himself with Ragnarok, he felt he had more freedom to do what he wanted with Love and Thunder. I'm not gonna sit here and say Taika did X because of Y and blah blah blah. I can only speculate. But what I can say with almost certainty is that he had a lot more freedom with Thor Love and Thunder, and it appears no one at the head of Marvel held him accountable. So, Thor Love and Thunder 1 year later. Now that I have rewatched this movie and we've had a few more MCU stories under our belt, is the MCU really dead? And were these problems present in Thor Love and Thunder? After some intense thought, I think the largest issue the MCU is facing currently is its disconnectivity. What made the MCU so special was that we had never seen serialized storytelling on this scale before. Across 22 movies, we were seeing stories develop over 4 or 5 or 6 movies, sometimes more. Sure, there were some fantastic movies, but what made the MCU so much fun to invest in was knowing that everything was connected. If you watched a movie called Ant-Man and the Wasp, you knew that would somehow play an important factor in Avengers Endgame. You frankly cannot watch any of the individual Marvel MCU trilogies without having seen the other movies. You can't watch Iron Man 3 without seeing the Avengers. You can't see Civil War without having watched Age of Ultron. You can't even watch Infinity War without really having seen Civil War. The MCU was one 22 movie story, and that was something we have never seen before. Come Phase 4, almost all of it feels disconnected. There are a few examples of connectivity, like WandaVision being connected to Multiverse of Madness, or Hawkeye being connected to the Black Widow movie. But besides that, and maybe a few other minor examples, there isn't any connectivity. A giant ancient being rose from the sea, and it is not once mentioned again. I know they're setting up something with Kang. I'm not really aware of the comic story of the Kang Dynasty or Secret Wars, but they are building to something. How many of these MCU Phase 4 stories do you think have tied into that? Half of them have spoken about the multiverse, but only Loki has mentioned Kang. Now come Phase 5, we did get Ant-Man 3, but we'll have to wait and see how else it develops. The approach to Phase 4 and 5 seems to be giving people the freedom to tell their own individual stories in the Marvel Universe. Movies like Eternals, or Thor Love and Thunder, or Black Panther 2, or Guardians 3 have nothing to do with one another, and are pretty much completely self-contained. I respect this decision to just want to focus on telling a good self-contained story without the burden of a wider universe. Now, what I'm about to say may get me in trouble, but I don't think MCU fans are MCU fans because of good movies. They're MCU fans because of the story of the entire universe. Can you picture the Eternals being in the same universe as She-Hulk? I can't. So Marvel switching away from this, I don't think has worked in their favor. As I spoke about before with Thor Love and Thunder, Taika seems to have ignored a lot of what came before, and a lot of MCU fans are bothered by that. So is the MCU dead? No, because we still got most of Phase 5 and all of Phase 6. There's still time to right the ship, but it's undeniable that a lot of people aren't happy, and I think Thor Love and Thunder is a prime example of that 1 year later. So what do you guys think? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.